Hey, peace, family. Welcome to another episode of Black on Black Violence, the Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation. I am Ikemba, or Dr. Ikemba Jore, and it's a pleasure to have you join this discussion. But if you're joining us and you're watching this, make sure that you like and share this podcast. Make sure you like and share this podcast and book club. And this podcast and book club is a part of the podcast and book club that we do every Saturday. It's in that series on Saturdays. I'm joined by Frank and Natasha every Saturday at 10 a.m. So make sure that you subscribe to We Charge Colonialism, our YouTube channel. Subscribe. Make sure you're following us on Facebook as well, so that you can tune into our podcast and book club every Saturday at 10 a.m. This particular segment, I cover Dr. Amerson Wilson's Black on Black Violence, the Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. Though that's the title of the book, the term or the characterization that I will use in regarding Black on Black violence is going to be intercommunal violence or horizontal violence. All right. I know last time I did this, somebody was going crazy in the chat, like it's not Black on Black violence. So actually, or stop saying Black on Black violence. So, I only use it in reference to this particular book and study. But the objective or goal of this discussion is to analyze intercommunal violence, its causes, its effects, but to come up with solutions to address these problems. I'm in Philadelphia, also Brooklyn, New York, and the violence, the intercommunal violence that takes place in our communities in both of these places it's egregious, and it's been that way for decades. So we haven't really come up with viable solutions to this problem, and part of it is that we're not really getting to the root of the problem, which is colonialism, colonial capitalism, as well as racism. So with that being said, though, just a few things, some housekeeping. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. You can also become a Patreon member and support us that way. We do have a Patreon account. We're building that up. And in the future, we plan on having some discussions. For those people who are members of our Patreon account, you have an opportunity to join in We Charge Colonialism membership discussions. So I'll put the link up right there. The link is in the description, so you can hit that, follow us, but become a Patreon member. So we're going to get right into it. I have a few links that I'm going to share before we get into the book, Black on Black Violence. This isn't going to be a long podcast, but this is a series, and we're going to continue to do this weekly, maybe even twice a week, to really get into the problems that we are facing in Chicago and St. Petersburg and St. Louis, Philadelphia, Oakland, and even on the continent of Africa, wherever Black people are, Jamaica, Haiti. This is an issue that needs to be addressed. So let me share my screen. I'm gonna share my screen and show you what's taking place in DC coming this November. The 14th annual Black People's March on the White House. This is going to be led by the Black is Back Coalition. So concerning violence, political power, and guns, Black community control of the police. Very fitting, right? The topic of this discussion. So for those people who are in the DC area, those people who are interested in joining this, there's going to be a march, and there's also going to be a conference on the 6th. So November 5th is a Raleigh march at Malcolm X Park, and then on November 6th, the Black People's Conference. This is led by the Black is Back Coalition. You can go to blackisbackcoalition.org for more information on that. All right, so now let's get into it. Let's have this discussion. Remember, like and share this podcast because I want to get as many people to be a part of this particular discussion, because it's a problem that no one is going to be able to solve but us. And when we look at the history of intercommunal violence, we'll see just from these particular articles that I'm going to pull up right now that the colonizer knew that there was an issue, but decided not to do anything about it. So let me share this. All right, this particular article right here from Victimology, Black on Black violence. Let me enlarge my screen. So Black on Black homicide, a psychological, political perspective. So I'm going to go through this. This is from Victimology. This is volume 8. You can see the date on here, 1983. This is 1983, right? And then I'm going to go into another article from the 70s. So the author is A.F. Poussaint. They published 1983. He says, Black homicide rates are 7 to 8 times those of whites, though Blacks have a rate of poverty only 4 to 5 times that of whites. Both of those is contradictions right there. But I think the point that's being made that even though whites are impoverished as well, or although Blacks are impoverished only 4 to 5 times, says only, but that's a contradiction, right? Why 4 to 5 times when we represent a numerical minority in the country, right, with a majority of whites? We still, are disproportionately impoverished. But despite that, we still have the homicide rate is double the poverty rate that we have. So what's going on within the impoverished Black community that there is more violence being committed, right? This disproportional amount of violence that's being committed. And so this is an abstract of the article right here. So I'm going to read this. Today, homicide is the leading cause of death among young Black men and contributes significantly to the shortened lifespan of the Black male. In about 80 to 90% of the cases, the Black victim was killed by another Black, and about 52% of the murder victims were acquainted with their assailant. Just as we accept that suicide victims are psychologically impaired, we must acknowledge that a murderer is similarly impaired, and Blacks, for both environmental and political reasons, are likely to reflect emotional predispositions, emotional predispositions, had to say it 3 times, that allow them to more readily become a homicide statistic. Projected self-hatred facilitates blind rage and gives the perpetrator of the violent attack a sense of legitimacy and justification. In addition, Blacks have been indoctrinated by a criminal justice system which places higher value on a white life than on a Black life. While psychological study of homicide offenders and victims is difficult and not easily quantifiable, it is important to explore such variables in Black community violence. Programs focused on crime and violence prevention, therefore, must do more than alleviate socioeconomic ills in the Black community. Do more than that. They must pay attention as well to negative psychological dynamics in the Black experience that contribute to internecine victimization. The Black community in particular is in dire need of homicide prevention. Hear that? In dire need of homicide prevention centers with programs of prevention, research, and treatment. So even, just going to that last sentence, and then we can unpack some more of this, but the Black community, it was suggested in particular, is in dire need of homicide prevention centers with programs of prevention, research, and treatment. So even though this was part of the discussion back in the 1980s, there was no homicide prevention centers that was ever established during this period of the 80s and the 90s to address this homicide rate, this increased homicide rate. As a matter of fact, in the 1970s, and another article talked about in the 1970s, I think it's 77, there were more Black people killed in 1977 by homicide than was killed in the entire Vietnam War. In the entire Vietnam War, more Blacks was killed in 1977, right? 1 year. And so with that being said, like the signs was there that was a contradiction in the social system. What's very interesting though is that this increase was taking place right after they quelled or squelched the Black Power movement. Right after that. So there has to be a connection there as well. The connection that was given by the colonizer was the Black Power movement promotion. This was the very first episode I did. Promotion of violence was the reason there was an uptick in violence in the Black community. But we're not going for that right there. That's colonizer propaganda. But I think that there is a connection with stripping the ability of African people or Black people in this country, particularly the United States, right? But we can talk about the world over. But stripping our power to be able to take on the colonizer and transform the system that has been oppressing and exploiting us. And so we have been forced to accept and legitimize the system with our acceptance and participation. So I'm kind of going off track, but this particular piece though is touching on this contradiction of Black on Black violence. But as you can see, this is why we charge colonialism is so important. This entire article, which we're not going to go through, is not going to touch on revolution transforming the colonial capitalist system. It does acknowledge the contradictions in regards to the social economic ills, which it says we can't just address that, right? But it talks about alleviating the social economic ills in the Black community. So it acknowledges that. It acknowledges that a white life is given more value than a Black life, right? Black Lives Matter, right? But it's being acknowledged in this particular article that this is taking place in the community. But it doesn't go into the history that created all this in regards to the hatred, the violence and the hatred committed by whites against Blacks in this community, where it has been a social system where people have benefited from the very existence of Africans in this system as an underclass, as a class that can be exploited, oppressed, and brutalized at the hands of the white community for their own benefit and expense. All right. So I kind of like went on more than I wanted to, but I feel like this really needs to be unpacked. But I want to go to another article. This is posted on the U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs site, just in case those are interested in checking this out. So you can see that U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, and then let me share this other piece. I'm telling you, serious contradictions here. Serious contradictions. Hold on. Now check that. This next article is from Ebony's magazine. Why am I having struggling getting this one up? Okay, here we go. All right, so Black on Black crime, the cause, the consequences, the curses. And this was a special issue in August 7th, 1979. So this was prior, probably should have did it in order, but this is prior to the last article that I read. So annotation, Black on Black crime has reached a critical level. It is a problem whose causes, consequences, and responses are explored by the 23 articles of this special issue of Ebony magazine. I'm going to get this issue too. I haven't read this issue, but 23 articles that's dealing with this. This is, I think we all should be interested in checking this out. What were they talking about in 79? 1979. Here we are in 2022, and we're dealing with this uptick in Black on intercommunal violence or horizontal violence, right? So what wasn't addressed? What was spoken about during this time in that particular article, and wasn't addressed where we are at a point that we are experiencing more violence in our communities than we have seen in about 20, 30 years. So the abstract, although the Black community is not responsible for the external conditions that systematically create breeding grounds for crime, the community has the responsibility of doing what it can to attack the problems from within. This response is needed because such crime creates mistrust, uncertainty, fear, and anxiety in the community. More blacks were killed by other blacks in 1977 than died in an entire 9-year Vietnam War. Such crime has driven businesses and jobs from the community. Property crimes alone have cost black billions of dollars annually. Most important, the young have been profoundly affected by crime as they are most often the perpetrators and the victims. Such underlying causes of crime as racism and oppression manifest themselves in high unemployment rates. The majority of first offenders are out of work. Drug addiction, the breakdown of the urban family, and an unjust criminal justice system which shows more compassion for white victims of crime than for black victims, and which punishes black criminals more severely than whites. In addition, the prison system serves as a training ground for further crime, and the media may contribute to the crime problem by portrayals of violence in movies and on television. Responses to the problem include the push for excellence programs, community involvement programs, reformation of the criminal justice system to deal severely with criminals, development of a national plan for alleviating the economic ills of the ghetto, and a reaffirmation of religious values. Right? Not a religious person, but in this piece again, like it's addressing the contradictions. It's talking about solutions to the problem in 1979, right? But again, this particular piece, and I have to go through this Ebony magazine and read all these articles, but who is dressing colonial capitalism in these articles as the source of all of these problems? Like, these are good, band-aids. And I will admit that if these things were implemented, it may have put us in a better situation, or conditions may have improved over the decades. But I don't think that it would have resolved the violence, though. It may have the numbers that we have seen in the 80s and the 90s. There may have been a decrease, but would it have solved the political economic contradiction that exists in the United States? If anything, it would have probably deepened our oppression in this country as a result of these programs, because the programs that are usually instituted by the colonizer are programs to get us to adjust to the system. Now, I had to pause when I said that, just so that we're clear. Like, any program, any institution that is established by the colonizer, by this social system to address our problems, is only to get us to adjust to the system of oppression and exploitation. As Black people, we have to be revolutionaries. The revolutionary mindset, revolutionary behavior and action is the only way to solve these problems. And so when I say revolutionary too, hope folks don't get scared by me saying revolutionary, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go pick up an AK and go out there and fight the system, in that way. We have this right here, right? Intelligence to be able to fight our oppressors and colonizers. Now, we may need to defend ourselves by those means. When that time comes, we have that conversation. But I'm talking about a revolutionary way of behaving within the colonial capitalist system, where we're building institutions that can contend with the colonizer institutions, and where we separate ourselves from a system of oppression and exploitation. Now, anybody who wants to support us in doing that, that's cool. But, the onus is on us to be able to build those institutions, and no one else. We can't go to the people who've created the problem to come up with the solutions to solve the problem. So, I wanted to share these two particular articles. Last thing I'm going to share before we go into this piece by Dr. Amerson Wilson is just, more evidence. And I wish I had time to really dive into this stuff, but more evidence of the lack of a will on the colonizer to address our problems anyway. Like, they do the research and they see what the issue is. They foreseen this increase in violence in our community. And did they put resources in the community? Did they institute those homicide prevention centers in the 80s or the 90s? Did we see those in our communities? No, because the violence in our behavior in this community is for a purpose. The way that we behave and think in this community serves a purpose for those who are in positions of power. Remember that from the very beginning, from the very establishment of the colonial American English system, and after the revolution, the establishment of the United States government, Black people served the purpose within this system, and we still do. So that's why we're here and we're still a part of this system. That's why they tell us, like, you're citizens, and this fight for equal rights, all of that happens, and white liberals lead us along, right? And have us believe that we will be equal citizens within this country. All of that is for a purpose, because they don't want us to separate from the system. But let me share this real quick, and then we go into this book. So this is a study that was put out, the history of violence as a public health issue, right? So this is when violence began to be looked at as a health issue in this country. And so right here in this piece right here, in this first paragraph, the history of violence as a public health issue, when and how violence was recognized as a matter for national and then global public health intervention. Even though they knew what was happening in the 70s and the 80s in the Black community, right? But then when this increase in the white community was taking place as well, this was when it's really, really has been a concern. And when you look at the numbers, just on a side note, when you look at the statistics, look at homicide rates, look at homicide rates, perpetrators and those who are victims after the year 2000, and look at it before the year 2000. The white community was on par with the Black community. There wasn't a very huge difference between those two communities. I did the research. Trust me. Look at those numbers. And if you look at the numbers after 2000, the white community violence, gun violence began to decline in the white community. Now, they're still tearing up in all other areas, though. The white community actually commits more crime than Black folks, right? And that's for another discussion. But just to stick with gun violence, the white community began to increase. The numbers are no longer, there's a huge difference in perpetrators, the race of the perpetrator and the victim of the perpetrator. Before 2000 is very similar. So when I'm looking at this health study, and then how violence began to be looked at as a health problem, right? Who is benefiting from these studies, this research, in the institutions or the programs that are being established to address the violence in the United States? So it says violence is now clearly recognized as a public health problem, but just 30 years ago, the word violence and health were rarely used in the same sentence. Several important trends contribute to a growing recognition and acceptance that violence could be addressed from a public health perspective. And so it gets into like the decrease in diseases, such as smallpox, right here, yellow fever, typhus, poliomyelitis, diphtheria, and pertussis. So the decrease in these diseases and the increase in the homicide rate, they begin to shift their focus on homicides and suicides. But I just want to show this timeline. If you look at this timeline, violence prevention timeline, in 1979, check this out. I hope y'all getting this the way I'm getting it. But in 1979, a report from the Surgeon General of the United States, Healthy People, the Surgeon General's report on health promotion and disease prevention, identifies violence as one of the 15 priority areas for the nation. The report states that violence can be prevented and should not be ignored in an effort to improve the nation's health. 1980, the first measurable objectives for violence are established for the nation by the Department of Health and Human Services. And so you see in 1981, 1983, CDC establishes the Violence Epidemiology Branch to focus its public health effort in violence prevention. And I'm going to scroll down to another timeline. So 1985, I'm going into the middle, the report of the Secretary's Task Force on Black and Minority Health is released and underscores the importance of addressing interpersonal violence as a public health problem. This is 1985, and identifies homicide as a major contributor to health disparities, among African Americans. Why has nobody been able to solve these problems? Here we are, how many years later? Going on 30 years later, I'm sorry, 40 years later, on 40 years later, and we're still dealing with this because the colonial system it's not in their interest to solve these problems. And I'm gonna go to if you study sociology, they're talking about functional theory and how deviation in crime serves a function within the society. And as a matter of fact, before I don't want to so last timeline, look at a 1990. Violent and abusive behavior is included as one of 22 public health priority areas in Healthy People 2000. The National Disease Prevention and Health Promotion Strategy. It calls for cooperation and integration across public health, healthcare, mental health, criminal justice, social service, education, and other relevant sectors. So there's a lot of conversation that's being had, a lot of study and research that is taking place, but nobody is addressing the root of the problem. And we shouldn't expect the system, those people who uphold this system, because their task, their interest is upholding or maintaining the colonial capitalist system because they benefit from it. Even the people who are doing these studies and research are benefiting from the colonial capitalist system. So they're not going to indict the very system that is pumping resources into these institutions so they can even do these studies. They can't do it. It would be a contradiction. It would be a contradiction. That's why it's up for us to solve our problems. So last thing, I just want to go, I talked about functional theory. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if you study sociology, there's different theories on the causes of crime, and functional theory is one of them. And I'll go through some of these other theories at another time, but I just want to deal with functional theory for a second. And so I'm going to read this. It says, any satisfactory account of the nature of crime must be sociological because what crime is depends on the social institutions of a society. Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, always says that laws are the opinions of the ruling class, right? So it's in their interest to institute laws or to institute rules that's going to sustain their position of power. And criminalize those people who go against the status quo, to go against established rules of engagement within that within the colonial capitalist society. So there's established rules of engagement. The thing is, African people not being considered citizens or people within the society historically, they weren't able to they were outside they were marginalized, and they was outside the rules of this engagement. So they couldn't even engage in the system. And so when they were at least allowed, they were still limited. Their rights were being abridged according to the Constitution, right? When granted citizenship, their rights were still being abridged. And so African Americans and Black people within the United States had to find other means to survive. And so they had to go outside the rules of engagement. And even struggling against the system itself will go outside the rules of engagement within the system. So what we began to do was to raise the contradiction in regards to the rights. These are the rules of engagement, but we're not allowed to participate in, which we shouldn't anyway. But that's a whole nother discussion. But if we're going to be a part of this system, we should at least be granted the same rights. But any struggle against the system is considered illegal. You struggle and try to dismantle the system, that's considered illegal. It's just so many different. Is when you're not a part of the power structure, when you're not at that table making the rules, like anything you do is going to be considered criminal. You have to go along with the system and those people who are in positions of power and hope that they open the doors for some of you to get in. And they have. And so this is why we have people from our own community who align themselves with the very oppressor that we are trying to that we are fighting or struggling against. Right. So I wanted to read this, and then I'll go into the book. It says functionalist theories. Functionalist theories argue that crime occurs when the aspirations of individuals and groups do not coincide with available opportunities. The disparities between desires and fulfillment will lead to deviant behavior, right? And so Durkheim, Emil Durkheim, he's considered like one of the fathers of sociology. As a matter of fact, Emil Durkheim is the person who influenced Huey P. Newton's theory of revolutionary suicide. If you read Revolutionary Suicide, he talks about Emil Durkheim and Emil Durkheim's work on suicide. But here, Durkheim, he says deviance is also necessary for society, right? I'm not going to read too much of this, but the point is deviance being necessary, or our behavior in a sense, whether it's violence towards each other, or drug addiction, drug abuse, these sort of things, the critical issues or social issues we're dealing with in our community is necessary. It wouldn't exist if it wasn't. But what we have to understand is the behavior that we exhibit is a reflection of the society itself. Intercommunal violence, or the violence we perpetrate against our brothers and sisters, that type of violence is inherent in this system. The colonizer is the first group of people who perpetrated that violence against the African community, Black community here in the States. They were the first person. This is the behavior that we exhibit, and that's why Dr. Emerson Wilson says the psychodynamics of Black self-annihilation in service of white domination. In service of white domination, they no longer have to commit those egregious acts against the Black community because we committed against ourselves. I mean, it's really deep when you think about it. But let's get into this book. I don't want to keep you guys here all night. But we're going to continue this discussion. And let me see. I'm starting on page 4, personality and culture. I'm going to read a couple of pages, discuss, and then we can call it a night. So personality and culture. Dr. Emerson Wilson says, like personality, society or culture can be said to possess a modal character or identity and correlated behavior orientation. A correlated behavior orientation. Society may also be said to possess a collective consciousness, self-image, and worldview. A society may be useful, schematized as consisting of any number of dynamically interacting socio-economic group complexes, class or social status divisions. A society's effect on its environment, its behavioral style, standing and prestige, its self-image, degree of internal integration, harmony, equilibrium, and integrity are functions of the dynamic nature of character of its constituent intergroup relations, its geophysical, historical, cultural, and other circumstances. In sum, the modal character of a society may be said to be manifested of the interactive outcome of its intergroup complexes and of its interactive relations with external forces. The nature and character of the interactions between its constituent groups or classes determine to a measurable extent the nature of its social symptoms, such as criminality. Applying somewhat simplistically the psychoanalytical model of personality to social processes, we contend that society may be usefully perceived as possessing societal group or class ego complexes, and that these group complexes interact dynamically. A society's ruling or influential groups, which may be construed to represent its social and societal ego complex, along with their collective perceptions and behavioral styles, dominate what may be called the societal personality. That is, society may be perceived as possessing a central group ego complex comprised of its dominant and most influential group, among other group complexes with which it or they influentially interacts. The central society ego group complex evinces a collective consciousness, self-consciousness, and self-image, which it seeks to present as the exclusive and legitimate projections of the societal personality. The central societal ego group complex, like the individual ego complex, is motivated by self-preservation, defensive security, desire for social status, power, hegemony, material comforts, and pleasure. Generally, the central group societal complex seeks to regulate and maintain its interactions with the other group complexes so as to derive the greatest quantity and the highest quality of benefits for itself. Social symptoms such as criminality, its type and distribution may reflect the outcome of the central group complex's attempts to gain and or maintain social economic advantages over the other social groups which are deprived of such advantages. To reiterate, the societal central complex may be roughly identified as the society's ruling, managing classes and other influential groups. In the United States of America, the central societal ego complex is represented by the white American ruling and middle classes and related white groups. These classes and groups generally seek to determine and govern the character and behavior of the societal whole in such ways as to maintain and enhance their wealth, power, and dominance. These activities, resources, powers, and perceptions of the subordinate group complex and less influential social groups are regulated and exploited by the white American community in ways that legitimize and strengthen that ruling complex's dominant position. The subordinate group ego complex refers to the African American community and related low status groups. As far as the white American community is concerned, the African American community and related groups function to support and service its dominance. The white community legislates, enforces, and reinforces the role, functions, and behavioral boundaries of the African American community in accordance with its dominance needs. By these means, the place of the African American community relative to the white American community is legitimized. Consequently, autonomous displacement by the African American community, labeled illegitimate or illegal by the white American community, may be perceived by that community as threatening its well-being and synonymously the well-being of the societal whole. The well-being of the societal whole, of course, is closely identified with the well-being of the white American community. As long as the African Americans perform according to the roles prescribed for them by the white American community ego complex, as long as they maintain their defined places and form the background against which the preferred white American complex is projected, as long as they reasonably fit the self-serving stereotypes imposed on them by the white American complex, the African American community attains a functional invisibility, a shadowy existence at the periphery of the consciousness of the white community. It is the peripheral functional invisibility the African American community contributes to the character, power, and self-concept of the dominant white American community. However, when and if the African American community threatens to move or actually moves beyond its functional invisibility, when it attempts to escape its role definition, acts on its own volition, and thereby escapes dominant group controls, when it challenges the legitimacy and relative autonomy of the white American community, that community responds repressively. The repressive responses of the dominant white community complex to the autonomous activities of the African American community complex interact dynamically to create societal symptoms, some of which may be labeled criminal. As a result of the white American communal repression and projective stereotyping of the African American community, some segments of the African American community may actually assume a malevolent, anti-societal, self-destructive character. In this instance, the dominant white community complex in effect produces illness, symptoms, ailments, and complaints in the body politic of American society through its egoistical repression of the African American community and utilizes those elements to further its psychological and dominance needs. Thus, it reaps both primary and secondary benefits from its own created illness, which is us that he's talking about. We're created what takes our societal problems. I'm talking about the Black community societal problems. It's an illness that has been created by the white community to serve their interests. And so I'll read this last paragraph. However, in order to reduce any guilt, in order to reduce any guilt which may result from consciously acknowledging responsibility for inflicting pain on the African American communities and exploiting that affliction, right? Because they would never do that. That would be a contradiction in itself. To escape self-condemnation for violating its own vaunted morals, right? Talk about liberty, right? They talk about liberty and democracy, but still had slaves, these same people. So how do they rationalize that? How do they get around that that hypocrisy? So the dominant white American community must deny and distort its own role in producing the resultant symptoms, right? So we did all of this to you. We enslaved you. We Jim Crow black code you, right? But, you know, any problems that you have, we don't have nothing to do with that. We don't have nothing to do with any of the problems. All of the things that we produce, even though we produced it, like, hey, we stopped committing these atrocities. So you guys should be good now, right? And this is why Dr. Joy DeGroove's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, is another important book, and that should be in our library, something that we should study and analyze. It accomplishes this by a number of means, including authoritatively declaring that the symptoms are the result of the inherent nature of African American, and by developing a study in attention to or disregard of its instigative responsibility for producing those symptoms. By these means, the white American community can deny that it is itself deluded, maladjusted, abnormal, perhaps psychotic, and therefore not in need of curative restructuring, right? And this is why it's so important what Huey P. Newton had told us, power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. The white community, and peace and power to everybody out there that's viewing, the white community has been able to define the phenomenon. They've been able to, the contradictions that exist within this society, they've been able to describe and define that. Are the illness that they have created within our communities, they have been able to define and describe those illnesses. Therefore, they're able to come up with solutions for them, quote unquote solutions, right? But in our step to exercising the right to self-determination is going to begin with us being able to define phenomena, to be able to define our conditions, our situation. So we can't hesitate to call the system that they call democracy a colonial system, a hypocritical system. I mean, Malcolm X, man, he gave us the blueprint in how to even interact with the colonizers. He was the one who said that America is just as much a colonial power than Britain ever was, right? Malcolm taught us that in the 60s. Malcolm taught us that democracy in America is nothing but hypocrisy, right? Why are we still, many of us are still engaged in a system that is hypocritical? We're still fighting for rights in a system that has no intention at all in resolving our problems, because we just looked at studies that they did in the 80s that said that this is what needs to be done to prevent violence. And what did we see over the next few decades? We've seen an increase in violence, an increase in incarceration, right? That was the solution that they had: incarceration for black bodies, incarcerating black bodies. So, with that being said, I know a lot was said tonight. Don't want to keep you guys all night, but I appreciate everybody for joining this discussion. And we're going to do it again next week. So make sure that you follow or you subscribe to We Charge Colonialism, so you know the next time that we are doing a podcast. But this Friday, my comrade, partner in crime, Frank, is going to be doing a podcast. He does one every Friday, so make sure you tune into that. And we're going to be here Saturday at 10 a.m. Me, Natasha X, Frank, for another podcast. You want to check that out as well. And so I definitely want to leave you guys with the words of Huey P. Newton before we depart, right? And Huey P. Newton at the funeral of Jonathan Jackson said something very important. And I think that it's a mindset that we all should have. He said, if the penalty for the quest for freedom is death, then by death we escape to freedom. And so I'm going to leave you all for that. Malcolm X said, until we're ready to pay the ultimate price, we'll always be second-class citizens or slaves in the United States. So until next time, man, peace and power to you all. Appreciate you all.